On the night of July 22, 1991, while most residents of the city of Milwaukee had fallen asleep, a staggering figure burst out of the Oxford apartments. It was Tracy Edwards. Dangling from his wrist was a metal handcuff, catching the blue and red glow of a patrol car that happened to be passing by. Edwards' face was twisted with terror, his breathing ragged. He had just escaped from something the press would later call a museum of nightmares. Officers Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller entered apartment 213 at Edwards' direction. The moment the door opened, a thick, suffocating air, carrying an overpowering stench of decay, hit their senses. The apartment's occupant, a 31-year-old man with a calm, intellectual demeanor, explained in a steady voice that it was merely the smell of spoiled meat from a malfunctioning refrigerator. But the truth behind that odor would make the entire nation shudder in horror that very night. Officer Mueller opened a drawer in the bedroom. What he found was not personal belongings, but a stack of photographs documenting in explicit detail the violation of victims' bodies. "This is real," Mueller said to his partner. And when the refrigerator was fully opened, a human body part, specifically a victim's severed head, lay neatly on a shelf beside cans of beer that were still cold. Jeffrey Dahmer, whom neighbors had long regarded as a quiet chocolate factory worker, merely murmured, "For what I've done, I should leave this world." Jeffrey Dahmer was not merely a serial killer. He was a ruthless collector. Over 13 years, across 17 tragic cases, Dahmer created a private world inside the apartments he inhabited. A world of dark chemical experiments, painted skulls, and an altar built from the remains of the dead. How could a monster remain hidden for so long? Why were cries for help so inexplicably ignored? And what transformed an ordinary child into the Milwaukee cannibal? Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, into what appeared to be a quintessential American middle-class family of the time. His father, Lionel, was a promising chemist, and his mother, Joyce, worked as a teletype operator. From the outside, it looked like a perfect household, with a heritage blending German, Welsh, Norwegian, and Irish roots. Yet few people knew that even while he was still in the womb, the first disturbances had already begun to ripple through this child's nervous system. Medical records cited by mainstream media and case documents later revealed a troubling detail. Throughout her pregnancy, Joyce Dahmer suffered from panic attacks, persistent vomiting, and extreme sensitivity to sound. To manage her condition, doctors at the time prescribed a regimen of very powerful sedatives, including barbiturates and morphine, at times totaling as many as 26 pills a day. In later years, scientists and researchers proposed a major hypothesis: that this heavy chemical intervention during a critical stage of brain development may have created deep fractures in Jeffrey's sensory balance and behavioral control. At the age of 4, a significant physical turning point occurred. Jeffrey underwent surgery for an inguinal hernia. From a child once described as cheerful and energetic, he emerged from anesthesia markedly withdrawn and quiet. He began retreating into his own inner world, standing apart from the games of his peers, observing life like a stranger inside his own home. Jeffrey's living environment was far from peaceful. Lionel's frequent absences due to work and Joyce's prolonged bouts of depression turned the household into a battleground of neglect. Jeffrey witnessed heated arguments and episodes in which his mother deliberately drew attention through exaggerated anxiety. In the silence created by emotional absence, a strange fascination began to take root. Instead of playing sports or assembling toys, Jeffrey spent hours capturing insects and sealing them in jars. He began walking along rural roads in Bath Township, Ohio, searching for animals killed in traffic accidents. He led friends into the woods, not to explore, but to violate the bodies of these animals. He was driven by a curiosity to see how they were put together. At one point, he even nailed part of a dog's body to a tree as a way of asserting absolute ownership. Tragically, this curiosity was inadvertently encouraged by his father. Seeing his son's apparent interest in science, Lionel taught Jeffrey how to use chemicals and bleach to safely preserve bones. Jeffrey became fascinated by the sound and appearance of the smooth, white bones. To him, they did not represent death, but the preservation of an eternal beauty, unchanging, unwavering, and never leaving him. As he entered adolescence at Revere High School, Jeffrey became an outcast. In a bid for attention, he began staging bizarre pranks that classmates dubbed the Dahmer Show, pretending to have seizures or strokes in the school hallways to provoke laughter. But behind these performances lay a darker secret. At the age of 14, Jeffrey began abusing alcohol heavily, even at school, to numb the fantasies that were steadily invading his mind. He later admitted that alcohol was the only way he could face reality. During puberty, Jeffrey realized he was attracted to men, but his isolation twisted that desire into a craving for absolute possession and control. At 16, his first violent intent took shape. He hid in bushes near his home with a baseball bat, waiting for a jogger to pass so he could strike them and take them back to abuse. The plan failed only because no jogger appeared that day. Jeffrey quietly returned home, but the monster within him was fully awake, merely waiting for a more opportune moment to act on his depravity. Jeffrey Dahmer's childhood was not merely a series of tragedies, but a convergence of flawed components, from medical chemicals and personality-altering surgery to emotional neglect and misplaced lessons in chemistry. All of it paved the way for the summer of 1978, the moment when Jeffrey was no longer just a hunter of animal bones. Summer of 1978. 3 weeks after his high school graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer stood at a new threshold in his life, but not in the way his father had hoped. He was alone in an empty house in Ohio. His mother and younger brother had moved to Wisconsin, while his father was temporarily staying at a motel, preparing for life after the divorce. In total isolation, fueled by the sharp burn of alcohol, Jeffrey began to confront the urges born from fantasies he had cultivated throughout his youth. Then fate drew a stranger into Jeffrey's dark orbit. June 18, 1978. Stephen Mark Hicks, an energetic 18-year-old, was hitchhiking to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park. Jeffrey, with his gentle appearance and scholarly glasses, pulled over. He didn't offer Stephen a ride to the concert. Instead, he invited him back to his house to drink beer and listen to music. Stephen, harboring no suspicion of the stranger's friendliness, got into the car. He could not have known it would be the final journey of his life. Hours passed in alcohol and idle conversation. When Stephen felt he had had enough and wanted to leave, a strange panic seized Jeffrey. He did not want the presence of this new companion to disappear. As Stephen moved toward the door, a struggle broke out. Jeffrey grabbed a 4.5-kilogram dumbbell and struck Stephen forcefully twice on the back of the head, rendering him unconscious instantly. In the silent house, Jeffrey took Stephen's life by strangling him with the dumbbell's handle. It was the first tragic act that set a chain of nightmares into motion. Jeffrey then committed acts beside the victim that were utterly unacceptable, a clear sign that his psychological deviation had reached a severe level. Jeffrey spent the entire next day dealing with the scene. He dragged the victim into the basement and began the cold process of violating the body, stripping flesh from bone and using hydrochloric acid to destroy soft tissue, techniques he had practiced on animal carcasses since childhood. He packed the organs into black plastic bags for disposal. But an unexpected incident nearly exposed everything in those very first moments. While driving to dispose of the black plastic bags, Jeffrey was pulled over by police for drifting across lanes. As a flashlight beam swept across the ominous bags on the back seat, Jeffrey maintained a remarkably calm expression. He explained that they were simply household trash he was taking out for his parents. The officer was deceived by his polite, composed demeanor and let him go with a traffic citation. Jeffrey later smashed all of Stephen's bones with a hammer and scattered them throughout the woods behind the house. Years later, remaining fragments of molars and vertebrae would help police identify Jeffrey's first victim. That horrific event closed in a silence that lasted for the next 9 years. Jeffrey attempted to return to a normal life by enrolling at Ohio State University in August 1978, intending to major in business. But the darkness within him could not be dispelled by textbooks. He sank completely into alcohol, skipped exams, and saw his GPA collapse to a disastrous 0.45 out of 4.0. The only class in which he earned a B was rifle marksmanship, a skill disturbingly connected to the use of weapons. When his father paid an unexpected visit, all he found was a room filled with empty liquor bottles. After 3 months, Jeffrey dropped out of OSU, marking his first major failure at social integration. In January 1979, at his father's urging, Jeffrey enlisted in the U.S. Army. He trained as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, before being stationed in Baumholder, West Germany. In the military, Jeffrey was rated as an average soldier, but the darkness still followed him. 2 soldiers later testified that they had been assaulted by Jeffrey after being drugged in an armored vehicle in 1979. Due to severe alcohol abuse that drastically reduced his performance, Jeffrey was discharged in March 1981 for being unsuitable for service. The monster inside him had not been erased by military discipline. It was merely watching in silence, accumulating ever more twisted fantasies of controlling the human body. After leaving the army, Jeffrey lacked the courage to return home and face his father, so he chose to fly to Miami, Florida, to escape the northern cold and his family's judgment. There, he lived a drifting life, working at a fast food restaurant and burning through his wages on alcohol. At times, he slept on the beach and became a target of assaults. By late 1981, having reached the depths of loneliness and poverty, he called his father to beg for help and asked to return to Ohio. In an effort to pull his son away from alcoholism, Lionel sent Jeffrey to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, in 1982. At first, life there seemed promising. Jeffrey went to church with her, did household chores, and actively looked for work. He found a job as a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center, but this stability was only a thin facade. In August 1982, Jeffrey was arrested for exposing himself in front of a crowd of 25 women and children at a fair. Abnormal impulses toward exhibitionism were emerging more clearly than ever beneath the guise of a well-behaved grandson. In January 1985, Jeffrey began working the night shift at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. Working from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. further isolated him from the daytime world. A suggestive note from a man at the public library inadvertently stirred the fantasies of absolute possession and control that he had long craved. Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars, public bathhouses, and adult bookstores. He even stole a mannequin from a shopping mall to satisfy his deviant sexual urges, something his grandmother later discovered and demanded he throw away. In the darkness of public bathhouses, Jeffrey grew irritated when partners moved during sex. He began giving victims drinks laced with sleeping pills so he could assault them while they were unconscious. After one victim was hospitalized due to an overdose, Jeffrey was banned from the bathhouses and began using hotels to continue these acts. In 1986, he even conceived a plan to dig up the grave of a recently deceased young man and bring the body home, but the hardened soil thwarted the scheme. He was repeatedly arrested for indecent exposure to children and, in March 1987, was sentenced to 1 year of probation. The 9 years of silence since the first murder were not a period of remorse, but a gestation phase for a monster. And when that silence was finally broken, Milwaukee would face a nightmare beyond anything it could have imagined. Jeffrey Dahmer spent 9 years suppressing and nurturing his darkest fantasies. But by the end of 1987, the most horrific killing spree in Milwaukee's history officially began. On November 20th, 1987, while still living with his grandmother in West Allis, Jeffrey met a young man named Stephen Tuomi and invited him to the Ambassador Hotel. Jeffrey gave Stephen a drink laced with a sedative and engaged in sexual activity with him. Although Jeffrey did not intend to kill him, when he woke up the next morning, Stephen was dead, showing signs of severe trauma to the chest and extensive bruising. Jeffrey's hands and forearms were also bruised. Jeffrey realized he had caused Stephen's death but had no memory of how it happened. To deal with Stephen's body, Jeffrey hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the hotel room door and went to a nearby shopping mall to buy a large suitcase. He placed the body inside the suitcase before rigor mortis set in. After returning home, Jeffrey kept the suitcase in the basement for a week. He then dismembered the body, separating the head, arms, and legs from the torso, removed the flesh from the bones, cut the flesh into smaller pieces, and placed them in black plastic bags. The bones were wrapped in bedsheets and crushed. The entire process took about 2 hours, and Stephen's remains, except for the head, were discarded in the trash. Jeffrey wrapped Stephen's head in a blanket. 2 weeks later, he soaked it in a mixture of Soilex, an industrial cleaner with a strong alkaline base, and bleach, intending to keep the skull for his own pathological purposes. However, the process made the skull brittle and fragile, so Jeffrey crushed it and destroyed it completely. After the incident with Stephen Tuomi, Jeffrey actively sought out more victims. Most of them were met or became acquainted with him at bars and were lured back to his grandmother's house. About 2 months after Stephen Tuomi's death, Jeffrey met a 14-year-old Native American boy named James Dox Tater, also known as Jamie Dox Tater. On March 24, 1988, Jeffrey met his third victim, Richard Guerrero, 22 years old, Mexican-American, outside a gay bar called The Phoenix. As before, Jeffrey took Richard back to his grandmother's house and promised to pay him $50 to spend the night with him. Jeffrey drugged Richard and then killed him by strangling him with a leather belt. He then engaged in oral sexual activity with the victim's body. Jeffrey dismembered Richard's body within 24 hours, removing the flesh from the bones, crushing the bones, and disposing of most of the remains in the trash, just as he had done with the previous 2 victims. May 14, 1990. Jeffrey Dahmer moved into his new residence, apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments. His belongings consisted of more than just clothes and personal items. Inside sealed containers, Jeffrey brought with him the head and several body parts of his victim, Anthony Sears, from his previous residence. In this new space, free from his grandmother's supervision, Jeffrey's violence escalated to a new level. He transformed the small apartment into a museum of horrors, a place where time seemed to stop for anyone who crossed its threshold. Less than a week after settling in, Raymond Smith became the first victim to lose his life there. After rendering the victim unconscious with powerful sedatives, Jeffrey killed him by strangulation. In this apartment, he began a methodical process of chemically managing the crime scene, photographing the victim in various positions, then using sharp instruments to violate the body. Jeffrey boiled Raymond's remains in a steel pot with a Soilex solution to separate the bones, then stored the skull in a filing cabinet as a collectible. He began painting the skulls to preserve their physical beauty. Jeffrey did not stop at taking lives. He began conducting grotesque experiments on the biological structure of the dead. With victim Edward Smith in June 1990, he attempted to freeze the bones in a freezer to remove moisture, but the effort failed as the bones deteriorated. When he placed them in an oven, the skull exploded. Jeffrey later admitted to police that he felt disgusted because he was unable to preserve any part of Edward's body. His craving for possession turned Jeffrey into a fanatic, viewing the human body as nothing more than experimental material. In September 1990, Ernest Miller met Jeffrey at a bookstore and was brought back to apartment 213. This time, lacking sedatives, Jeffrey used a sharp instrument to cut directly into the carotid artery, causing the victim to bleed to death. After committing acts that were utterly unacceptable, Jeffrey removed the flesh and organs and boiled them into a gelatin-like mixture to clean the bones. More horrifying still, he began storing Ernest's heart, arm muscles, and leg meat in the refrigerator for preservation and later use. This marked the period when Jeffrey began engaging in cannibalism so that his victims could become a permanent part of his body. In 1991, Jeffrey's cruelty reached its peak with what he called frontal lobe experiments. He wanted to create obedient companions, beings stripped of free will. With Errol Lindsay and Conorak synthesomphone, Jeffrey drilled holes into their skulls and injected hydrochloric acid directly into their brains while they were still alive. When Errol regained consciousness after the procedure and complained of severe headaches, Jeffrey sedated him again before taking his life. He even skinned Errol with the intention of preserving the skin permanently, but later abandoned the attempt when the skin began to stiffen and wrinkle. The horrors inside apartment 213 were not entirely hidden. Neighbors began complaining to building management about the overpowering stench, the sound of objects crashing, and the noise of a power saw late at night. Jeffrey always had calm explanations ready. Sometimes he claimed a broken refrigerator had caused meat to spoil. Other times he said his tropical fish had died. It was precisely this composure and harmless appearance that allowed him to deflect suspicion for so long, ultimately leading to the greatest tragedy of his life, the tragedy known as Conorak synthesomphone. In the early morning hours of May 27, 1991, 14-year-old Conorak escaped from apartment 213 naked, with a head injury and barely able to stand due to the effects of acid and sedatives. A woman named Colleen Cola Stiles called the police. When Jeffrey appeared and tried to pull the boy away, Colleen bravely intervened. However, two officers, John Balserzak and Joseph Gabrish, made a fatal mistake. They accepted Jeffrey's calm explanation that Conorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, who was simply drunk. Despite strong objections from neighbors, the officers escorted Conorak back into the killer's apartment. Moments after they left, telling Jeffrey to take good care of him, Jeffrey injected more acid into Conorak's brain and took his life. Had the officers checked Jeffrey's record, they would have discovered that he was on probation for child sexual assault. After Conorak's death, Jeffrey entered an uncontrollable killing frenzy. In less than 2 months, 4 more victims were brought to apartment 213. He drugged Jeremiah Weinberger and injected boiling water into his brain, causing him to die after 2 days in a coma. With the final victim, Joseph Braidhoft, Jeffrey left the body on the bed for so long that when he pulled back the blanket, the head was already covered in maggots. Jeffrey later admitted he was in the process of constructing a meditation altar from the skulls of 13 victims, a place where he believed he could experience absolute power. Apartment 213 was no longer a residence. It had become an industrial slaughterhouse where every moral boundary and human value was crushed. Jeffrey Dahmer believed he could hide his museum of horrors forever. But on the night of July 22, 1991, that confidence collided with the raw survival instinct of a man named Tracy Edwards. The Milwaukee monster did not realize that his time in apartment 213 had truly run out. The night of July 22, 1991. All of Jeffrey Dahmer's efforts to conceal his crimes over the past 13 years were about to collapse. At the corner of North 25th Street, 2 patrol officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller, encountered a man named Tracy Edwards. Edwards' appearance was haunting. A metal handcuff dangling from his wrist, his face twisted in terror. He told the officers about a sick man who had threatened him with a weapon and chained him inside apartment 213. In that moment, a victim's instinct for survival inadvertently pulled back the curtain on a horrifying museum beyond anyone's imagination. As the officers entered apartment 213, a thick, putrid stench immediately assaulted their senses. Dahmer explained that it was simply the smell of a broken refrigerator, but Edward's gaze led them toward the bedroom. There, Mueller discovered a long, sharp instrument beneath the bed. What truly shattered the officer's composure, however, was a stack of Polaroid photographs in a drawer beside the bed. Images documenting, in explicit detail, the violation of human bodies, victims dismembered and arranged in suggestive poses. Miller turned to his partner and said, "This is real." As police moved to restrain Dahmer, the killer merely murmured, "For what I've done, I should leave this world." When the refrigerator door was opened, the nightmare finally took shape. A severed human head lay neatly on the bottom shelf, its eyes and mouth wide open, as if frozen in terror. The subsequent detailed search revealed a scale of crime beyond comprehension. 4 severed heads in the kitchen, 7 skulls, bleached or spray-painted, in the bedroom, and countless plastic bags filled with organs and dismembered body parts in the freezer. In the corner of the bedroom stood a 215-liter drum containing the remains of 3 victims decomposing in acid. Later, forensic investigators would remark that the place resembled the museum of a madman more than a crime scene. During more than 60 hours of interrogation, Dahmer never invoked his right to an attorney. He confessed to killing 17 men and minors. But the most shocking revelation was his motive. Dahmer wanted to keep them with him forever, driven by an overwhelming desire for absolute possession. He described constructing a grotesque altar, a black table holding 13 victims' skulls, surrounded by complete skeletons, candles, and blue lights. He claimed it was a place for meditation, where he could feel supreme power while surrounded by objects he completely owned. To Dahmer, the victims were no longer human beings, but offerings meant to satisfy his pathological urges. The trial began on January 30th, 1992. The world watched in stunned silence as proceedings unfolded against the man dubbed the Milwaukee Cannibal. Although defense attorneys attempted to argue that he suffered from severe neurological disorders, the court ruled that Dahmer was legally sane. He was convicted of killing 15 people in Wisconsin and sentenced to life imprisonment totaling 957 years. He later received a 16th life sentence in Ohio for the first murder committed in 1978. Justice had finally spoken, bringing an end to 13 years of darkness. But the pain inflicted upon the victims' families would never be healed. Jeffrey Dahmer was incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution, beginning a long existence behind bars. He once admitted that he deserved to die for what he had done. The fantasies of his so-called altar of power were reduced to ashes within a diseased mind now fully exposed to the light. But Dahmer's story did not end there. A harsher fate awaited him behind the prison walls, a final sentence that the law itself could not deliver. Jeffrey Dahmer began a new life behind bars at the Columbia Correctional Institution. During his first year, he was held in solitary confinement due to concerns about potential physical harm from other inmates. There, the man who had once spread nightmares turned to religion, reading the Bible and undergoing baptism in the hope of finding peace of mind. Yet the darkness never truly left him. Jeffrey frequently received letters and money from disturbing admirers, but he never replied to any of them. According to his mother, Joyce, Jeffrey had long been ready to die. He no longer cared about anything that might happen to him. On the morning of November 28, 1994, justice was carried out in the most brutal way. While assigned to clean the prison gym area alongside 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, Jeffrey was attacked. In the absence of a guard, Scarver used the metal bar of a dumbbell to strike Jeffrey forcefully in the head and face. Jeffrey died about an hour later at a hospital, at the age of 34. Scarver later stated that he acted because he could no longer tolerate Jeffrey's obscene taunting of other inmates, and because he wanted to exact justice for the victims Jeffrey had violated. The end of Jeffrey Dahmer did not erase the haunting questions he left behind. How could a modern justice system allow a monster to slip through its cracks for so long? The case of Konarak Synthosamphone remains a permanent scar on the Milwaukee Police Department. The two officers who returned the boy to his killer were initially dismissed, but later reinstated and even promoted. Audio recordings revealed demeaning and biased remarks toward the victim and witnesses. This was not merely an individual failure, but a systemic indifference toward vulnerable, marginalized communities. According to his wishes, Jeffrey was cremated. Yet even in death, he remained a source of controversy. His mother wanted to donate her son's brain to science to study the roots of psychopathy, but his father firmly refused. Ultimately, the court ordered the complete destruction of the remains so that Jeffrey could truly leave this world behind. The Oxford apartments, the site of the most horrific memories, were also demolished in an effort to help the city heal. But for the families of the 17 victims, the pain endures with every breath. The Jeffrey Dahmer file closes with a stark reminder about recognizing monsters hidden behind ordinary facades. It is a lesson in vigilance, compassion, and our collective responsibility to listen to silent cries for help. Do not let indifference become the ground in which darkness takes root.